Hey viewers! Hope you're all doing great. Before I start the story, tell me in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you enjoy my videos, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. The plague that reached Mecca. In the year 1348, across the windswept deserts and distant trade routes of the Islamic world, rumors began to drift like dust. Rumors of a sickness so terrible that entire cities had fallen silent. They said the air in Damascus had turned heavy with the scent of death. That in Cairo, funeral processions never ceased. That in the faraway lands of the Franks, the bells of Europe rang without pause, tolling for the dead. But for those living in the heart of Arabia, such tales felt impossibly distant. The sands were vast, the mountains protective, and the holy city of Mecca, where pilgrims came from every corner of the world, had survived the storms of time before. Yet, as the 14th century reached its darkest years, the Black Death, the great plague that had already swallowed empires, would not be stopped by sand or prayer. It would find its way even to Mecca, the sacred heart of Islam. Before we descend into those fevered days, we must understand the story behind this invisible invader. The Black Death, as it came to be known, was not a single event but a wave, rising first in the east and rolling relentlessly westward. Modern historians trace its beginnings to the arid plains of Central Asia, perhaps near the Tian Shan Mountains, where the bacterium Yersinia pestis had long dwelled in the bodies of wild rodents. Carried by fleas that thrived on their blood, the plague made its leap to humans when trade and war began to intertwine the lives of distant peoples. By the 1340s, the world was more connected than ever before. The Silk Road stretched from China to the Mediterranean, its caravans moving silk, spices, gold, and unknowingly death. Mongol horsemen rode these same paths, spreading stories and disease alike. When the Mongol armies besieged the port city of Kaffa on the Black Sea, the plague erupted among them. In a moment that would echo through history, they reportedly catapulted infected corpses into the city as a weapon of war. From there, fleeing merchants carried the sickness across the sea to Constantinople, to Sicily, and soon to every harbor that touched the Mediterranean. As Europe and the Levant burned with fever, the plague spread into the lands of Islam. Egypt became one of its great crossroads. The mighty city of Cairo, with its scholars and markets, was a jewel of the Mamluk Sultanate, and one of the busiest pilgrimage centers for those bound to Mecca. When the plague reached Cairo in 1348, its impact was beyond imagination. Chroniclers wrote that the city lost thousands each day. The great historian Ibn Khaldun would later write of his own parents dying in this very outbreak, describing how the world itself seemed to have changed course. From Cairo, caravans set forth southward along the old pilgrim roads, the Darb al-Hajj al-Misri. These were routes known for centuries, where water wells marked the passage through the wilderness, and where traders and pilgrims rested together under the same stars. Among them, invisible, the plague traveled. It crept from camp to camp, hidden in the blood of travelers and the fleas of camels, moving slowly toward the Hejaz, the western region of Arabia, home to Mecca and Medina. Few at first believed such a terror could reach the holy cities. Mecca had been protected by faith and isolation. But in that same year, 1349, according to many accounts, something strange began to happen. Imagine for a moment the world as it was then. The desert at dusk, painted in red and gold. The air dry and thin, carrying the chants of pilgrims as they approached the city. The marble of the Kaaba glowed softly beneath oil lamps, its black cloth shimmering in the flicker of flame. Merchants called out from their stalls. Travelers from Yemen, Persia, Egypt, and beyond rested under palm canopies. And yet, beneath that hum of devotion and life, whispers began to spread. Some said the caravans from Egypt had brought sickness. Others said it was a punishment from God, a trial for sins unseen. Still others claimed it was the same disease that had already devoured Damascus and Alexandria, a plague that spared neither scholar nor soldier. The first to fall ill were travelers. They came with fever and swelling in the groin and underarms, their skin turning dark as blood pooled beneath it. The physicians of Mecca, learned in the humoral theories of their time, prescribed purgatives and prayer, fumigations and fasting. But nothing slowed its grip. Death became constant. Within days, families vanished. Entire inns emptied, their doors swinging in the wind. The qadis, the judges, met with the city's scholars and imams, trying to decide whether the pilgrimage should be suspended. But how could the faithful abandon the house of God? The Hajj was not merely a journey. It was an obligation, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. And so, even as sickness spread, the pilgrims continued to arrive. One chronicler from the Mamluk period recorded that the air of Mecca grew foul and heavy, and the people fled into the hills. Yet few places offered safety. In nearby Medina, the city of the Prophet, the story was the same. From Cairo to Mecca to Medina, the plague crossed the sands and entered the holiest cities of the Muslim world. By the summer months, burial grounds overflowed. The call to prayer echoed over streets empty of life. Some historians estimate that the population of Mecca may have been reduced by half within months, though precise numbers are lost to time. What remains are fragments, letters, chronicles, travelers' notes, all painting the same picture of a world in mourning. Still, amid the grief, acts of faith and compassion endured. Men and women cared for the sick though they knew the risk. Scholars continued their readings of hadith, their voices trembling with fever. Pilgrims who survived told of nights filled with prayer, as though every breath might be their last. From these voices, a truth emerges, that even in the face of devastation, Mecca's spirit did not falter. The desert has always been a land of silence. In the 14th century, it was also a land of faith, an endless sea of sand that led every year to one destination: Mecca. From Egypt, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq, pilgrims set out in caravans so vast they appeared like moving cities. Camels carried supplies, tents, and waterskins. Guards rode along the flanks, while scholars recited verses to keep weary travelers steady through the long, punishing days. But in the year of the plague, that silence was broken by coughs and cries. In the Egyptian caravan, known as the Mamul al-Misri, sickness appeared first among the camel drivers. At first, it was dismissed as heat exhaustion. Then the swellings came, painful lumps beneath the arms and between the legs, and within a day, the men were gone. The survivors pressed on, afraid to linger where death had touched. Yet with every stop the plague found new hosts. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that the caravan roads became trails of sorrow. Water wells, once symbols of life, were now feared. At every station, bodies were buried quickly in shallow graves. There were not enough hands to dig deep. From the north, the Mamul al-Shami, the Syrian caravan, fared little better. It had departed from Damascus, a city already wounded by the same disease. There, the great mosque had become a refuge and a tomb. People gathered for communal prayers, believing that mass repentance might drive the plague away. Instead, it spread faster. The historian Ibn Battuta, who passed through the region shortly after, wrote of entire families perishing together, and markets so quiet that only the wind answered the call of the muezzin. When the Syrian pilgrims set out for Mecca, many were already sick. They carried with them the invisible plague that had turned their homeland into a graveyard. The desert winds could not cleanse it. As the caravans neared the Hejaz, the Bedouin tribes who lived along the trade routes began to notice strange patterns. Where once the road was filled with song and laughter, now the air was heavy with prayers for the dying. Merchants refused to trade with travelers, fearing the curse they carried. The inns and rest stations, khans and ribots, were abandoned one by one. Some burned their own bedding and tents, hoping to ward off the contagion. The Mamluk Sultan in Cairo received reports that the pilgrimage might collapse. The governors of the Hejaz wrote of entire groups perishing before reaching Mecca. But to halt the Hajj was unthinkable. So, despite fear and warning, the caravans continued to move, following the same paths that had been walked for centuries. In Mecca itself, the plague had already taken root. According to the Egyptian historian al-Makrizi, who compiled records of the Black Death's progress, Mecca's infection came through two sources: the arrival of sick pilgrims and the exchange of goods from the Red Sea ports. The plague had also spread by ship, carried by sailors along the coast from Aden and Jeddah. In both land and sea, the contagion found its way to the heart of the Islamic world. Imagine Mecca at that time, its narrow streets winding through stone houses, its markets alive with scents of myrrh and roasted grain, its courtyards filled with a murmur of prayer. Now imagine that same city falling silent. The muezzins still called the faithful to prayer, but their voices grew weaker as days passed. The pilgrims who reached the Kaaba performed their rites in tears, unsure if they would live to return home. The great marble floor of the sanctuary was washed daily, but the fear could not be cleansed. Physicians, trained in the ancient Greek and Islamic traditions, prescribed the burning of incense, the sealing of houses, and the drinking of vinegar. Yet the sickness did not yield. Some believed that the wind itself carried death. The air was said to have turned thick and still, as if poisoned by unseen hands. People hung herbs and camphor in their doorways, and some fled into the mountains of Tahama, hoping the higher air might spare them. Others gathered in the Masjid al-Haram, seeking protection through prayer. Chroniclers later wrote that many who prayed there died still kneeling. It was not only Mecca that suffered. Medina, the city of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, soon followed. Pilgrims who had traveled there to visit the Prophet's tomb brought the plague with them. Local records mention the closing of schools and lodgings, and that many of the ulama, the learned scholars, succumbed. The Hejaz became a land of mourning. Caravans returning to Cairo brought back fewer travelers than they had carried out. And with them, the plague returned once more to Egypt, completing its deadly circle. The scale of death defied measure. In Mecca, chroniclers recorded that funerals continued through the night, lit by torches that flickered like stars across the hillsides. Grave diggers were in short supply. Some families buried their own dead within their courtyards. The smell of incense and burning herbs filled the air, mingling with the dry dust of the desert. Yet, through all this, the Hajj never ceased. Even in the face of death, faith endured. The pilgrims who survived believed their journey had gained new meaning. To walk in the shadow of the Kaaba during those days was to feel the fragility of life and the closeness of the divine. For historians, the arrival of the Black Death in Mecca became a symbol of how far the plague had spread. From the mountains of China to the shores of the Red Sea, no border, political, geographic, or sacred, had been strong enough to resist it. The disease had moved through trade, pilgrimage, and empire, weaving the medieval world together in tragedy. It was, as many would later say, the moment when humanity realized that even the holiest places could be touched by mortal suffering. As the months turned, the plague began to wane, not because of cure or medicine, but because it had burned through all it could consume. When survivors looked upon Mecca again, they found a city changed. Markets reopened but slowly. The sound of the adhan, the call to prayer, returned to its full voice. Pilgrims still came, though fewer in number, their journeys marked by loss. Those who lived to tell of that year would pass their stories on to their children. In them, Mecca stood not as a place defeated, but as one that endured, its faith unbroken, even in the shadow of the world's greatest plague. When the fever winds finally passed, the survivors emerged into a world that felt thinner, quieter, and changed. The Kaaba still stood, its black cloth renewed, its stone kissed by trembling lips, but around it, the streets of Mecca carried an unfamiliar stillness. The market lanes, once alive with shouts and laughter, were half empty. The scent of burning myrrh lingered, a reminder of those nights when smoke was believed to guard against death. Yet amid that silence, men began to write. The Islamic world of the 14th century was one of pen and parchment, of chroniclers and scholars who believed that memory itself was an act of devotion. They recorded what they saw, not to shock or terrify, but to make sense of a world suddenly laid bare by fate. And so, the story of the plague that reached Mecca found its place in their works, fragmented but enduring. Among them was Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, a scholar of Cairo, who would later lose 3 of his daughters to the same disease. In his writings, he described the plague not only as a medical calamity but as a spiritual test. He compiled reports of outbreaks across the Muslim world, including Mecca, noting that the city was visited with the same affliction that had befallen the lands of the Franks and the lands of Egypt. From Damascus came the words of Ibn Kathir, who recorded in his chronicle Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya that the plague appeared in the sacred precincts of Mecca and Medina, as it had in every city before them. His tone was mournful, yet resigned, as though acknowledging that no place, no matter how holy, could stand apart from the will of God. In Egypt, Al-Makrizi wrote of caravans that left Cairo filled with joy and returned shrouded in mourning. He chronicled the tales of pilgrims who died along the desert path, and of those who buried their companions beneath nameless dunes. In his pages, Mecca's suffering became a symbol of the universality of death, a reminder that faith and fragility walk hand in hand. But not all chroniclers wrote from the cities of learning. Some were travelers, pilgrims who had seen the horror firsthand. One anonymous account, preserved in later compilations, described the 1349 pilgrimage in words that tremble across centuries. "We came to the holy city and found her veiled in sorrow. The gates were open, yet few entered. The air was heavy and the hearts heavier. I saw a man from Aden bury his wife near the hills of Mina and stand long in silence before the Kaaba. He said nothing, but his tears fell like the water of Zamzam, and I thought then that the earth itself was weeping." Such writings do not offer numbers or lists. They offer feeling, the texture of grief that statistics cannot convey. The question of how many died in Mecca will never be answered with certainty. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerated or rounded their numbers, writing in the language of awe rather than arithmetic. But most agree that the death toll was immense. In Cairo, records suggest that thousands perished daily at the height of the plague. In Mecca, though smaller, the proportion may have been even higher. Yet what fascinates historians today is not only how many died, but how the living understood what had happened. To them, the plague was not an accident of nature. It was a visitation. Some viewed it as divine punishment, others as a test of faith. In the writings of Ibn Hajar and others, one finds verses of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, quoted with deep reverence. "If you hear of an outbreak of plague in a land, do not enter it, and if it occurs in a land where you are, do not leave it." These words, centuries old even then, became the basis for early Islamic approaches to quarantine. The scholars of Mecca discussed these sayings in the shadow of death, trying to interpret them for a world that suddenly needed both science and faith to survive. Outside the city, the ripple of the plague continued. Trade routes slowed to a crawl. Caravans moved with hesitation. The Darb al-Hajj, the Egyptian and Syrian roads, became emptier than anyone could remember. Water wells were abandoned for fear of contamination. Entire Bedouin tribes, dependent on the passing pilgrims for trade, faced famine as travel diminished. In Cairo, the Mamluk administration faced collapse. The plague had killed soldiers, governors, and imams alike. Taxes fell, harvests failed, and the Sultan himself, Al-Nasir Hassan, was said to have locked himself away for months, afraid to appear in public. The empire that had built mosques and palaces now struggled simply to bury its dead. And yet Mecca endured. Through the following years, the city would rise again with the return of life. Pilgrims once more filled its streets. The caravans returned, though their numbers were smaller. Scholars resumed their lessons beside the Kaaba. The Black Death did not end faith. It reshaped it. In its aftermath, sermons and writings began to focus more deeply on mortality, on the fragility of worldly power, and the nearness of divine mercy. For the Muslim world, it became a time of introspection and renewal. In the centuries that followed, memory of the plague lived on in the rhythm of the Hajj itself. Each year, as pilgrims assembled in the great squares of Cairo or Damascus, there were prayers of protection against disease. Before departing, the Imam would remind them of the years when the pilgrimage had been shadowed by death, and how Allah had seen them through. The story became both a warning and a comfort. Travelers in later centuries, like the Ottoman scholar Evliya Çelebi, still wrote of those days with awe, as though the memory of the plague was part of the sacred geography of the Hejaz. Mecca had suffered, yes, but it had also been sanctified by endurance. By the time Europe's Renaissance dawned, the Black Death had faded into legend for many lands. But in the chronicles of the Muslim world, and in the quiet prayers of pilgrims crossing the desert, it remained alive, not as horror, but as history, woven into the tapestry of faith. When the storm of death at last subsided, the question that lingered over Mecca and the lands beyond was one that would echo through generations. How does a holy city heal? For months, the scent of smoke hung in the air. People burned herbs, myrrh, and sandalwood, believing that smoke purified what the plague had poisoned. The courtyards of homes were swept clean daily. Water was sprinkled to cool the air, and doorways were marked with verses from the Quran. The survivors moved softly through the streets, as though the city itself had become sacred ground. From the Red Sea coast to the highlands of the Hejaz, the plague left traces not only in graves but in minds. Those who had lived through it found that their world of certainty had shifted. The rhythm of pilgrimage, once steady as the desert winds, now carried a tremor of fear. Yet it also carried new understanding, one that joined faith with inquiry, devotion with observation. In Cairo, Damascus, and Mecca alike, scholars of medicine began to study the plague with renewed intensity. Islamic medicine had long been a blend of spiritual and empirical thought. Physicians like Ibn Sina and al-Razi had centuries earlier written on the causes of disease, describing contagion in ways that approached modern understanding. But now the urgency was different. The famous Egyptian physician Ibn Khatib of Granada wrote boldly that plague spread by infection, carried from garment to garment and house to house. Though his writings were controversial, they signaled a turning point. Other doctors in the Mamluk realm took note. In Mecca, healers began to isolate the sick, not out of modern science but from observation. Those who stayed apart survived more often. Water wells were covered. Tents were spaced wider apart in pilgrim camps. When the next season of Hajj approached, city leaders debated whether to limit arrivals. No one dared forbid the pilgrimage entirely, but steps were taken quietly. Fewer delegations were received, and special cleansing rituals were performed around the Kaaba. The Mamluk authorities in Egypt established new public health measures in the years that followed. Caravan leaders were instructed to inspect travelers for signs of illness. Physicians were assigned to accompany pilgrim groups. In Medina, small isolation quarters, rudimentary but significant, were set up near the city gates for those showing symptoms. It was not quarantine as the modern world would know it, but its roots were here, born from the terror that had once swept through the holy cities. The intellectual reaction to the plague was equally profound. The great thinker Ibn Khaldun, writing in North Africa, lost both his parents to the epidemic. In his Muqaddimah, he reflected that the plague devastated nations and swallowed up many of the good things of civilization. He argued that societies, like living beings, pass through cycles of birth, strength, decay, and death, and the plague had hastened that cycle. His words found echo in Mecca, where scholars saw in the Black Death a divine reminder of impermanence. Sermons in the Masjid al-Haram spoke not of despair but of humility. They taught that knowledge, like faith, must serve to protect life. Physicians were urged to learn, to observe, and to act, not merely to pray for mercy. Thus began a quiet transformation in the intellectual life of the Islamic world. From Cairo's medical schools to Mecca's libraries, texts were copied, expanded, and reinterpreted. Writings on hygiene, diet, and urban sanitation began to circulate. In time, they would influence Ottoman and later European medical thought. Still, healing was not only a matter of learning, it was a matter of living again. Slowly, the city's rhythm returned. The sound of merchants calling out by the market gates, the laughter of children running near the Zamzam well, the heavy steps of camels arriving from the desert. All these became signs that Mecca had survived. Pilgrims who came in the years after the plague spoke of a strange feeling in the city, a mix of reverence and melancholy. They described ruins still standing where homes had been left empty, and gardens overgrown around the city's edges. Yet they also wrote of renewed devotion. One Syrian pilgrim in 1352 recorded that the air of Mecca was sweet again, and the people grateful beyond measure. He wrote of women baking bread to share with strangers, of men building shaded awnings for travelers to rest beneath, and of scholars reciting prayers for those who had died. The city, he said, had become both grave and sanctuary. Such gestures were not merely acts of kindness, they were the rebuilding of society. The bonds of charity and community that had always defined Mecca's life were strengthened by shared loss. The plague had reshaped the pilgrimage routes themselves. Many of the traditional resting stations, small towns and oases that had once thrived on trade, never recovered. Some were abandoned entirely, reclaimed by the desert. Others grew, adapting to new roles as fortified halts where caravans could be inspected or rested safely. The routes shifted subtly over time, bending toward regions with cleaner water, more open air, and safer passage. The trade that had once moved along those same paths also changed. Merchants grew wary of exchanging goods with distant ports too soon after outbreaks. In the long run, this slowed but did not sever the ancient flow between East and West. The world learned to move more carefully, to respect the unseen dangers that traveled alongside silk and spice. Spiritually, the plague left a deep mark on the consciousness of the Muslim world. It reminded scholars and rulers alike of a principle that had always been part of the faith: that life, no matter how sacred or protected, is bound by divine decree. For those who survived, Mecca's endurance became proof not of invincibility, but of mercy. In later centuries, poets and preachers alike would speak of the plague that reached the holy city. They called it al-waba, the great pestilence. In their verses, Mecca was portrayed not as a city defeated, but as a city tested and purified. A line from one 15th century Sufi poet captures the feeling best. The desert burned, the people wept, the stars watched in silence. Yet when the dawn returned to Mecca, its stones glowed with patience. Thus, even as the Black Death vanished from memory in other lands, its lessons endured here. In the sacred geography of faith, in the cautious wisdom of travelers, in the understanding that life's fragility is part of its sanctity. The pilgrims continued to come. The prayers continued to rise. And the desert, timeless and still, held the memory of those who had walked across it in hope, in fear, and in faith. By the time the next generation had grown, the Black Death was no longer a present terror. It had become a memory, whispered softly by elders who still recalled the silence that once fell over Mecca. But memory has its own life. It settles not only in minds but in architecture, in writing, in ritual. And in the holy city, memory became a kind of worship. For the survivors and their descendants, the plague was not to be forgotten. It was a scar on the world's face, and to erase it would have been to dishonor the endurance it had demanded. Instead, the memory was woven into daily devotion. Pilgrims who arrived in Mecca decades later could still see the traces. Certain wells were marked with stones bearing verses of protection, reminders of the time when water itself had been feared. The narrow streets where the dead had once been carried were renamed or rebuilt, but stories clung to them. At night, older residents told of the year of the silence, when the markets had gone still, and even the wind seemed to carry prayers. Architecture became a language of remembrance. In the late 14th century, during the reign of Sultan al-Ashraf Shaban of Egypt, charitable endowments, Awqaf, were established to maintain cleanliness around the Kaaba and to provide water to pilgrims. Though such institutions had existed before, their expansion after the plague was striking. Many of these sables, water fountains, and hospitals were funded in direct response to what had been lost. Each fountain, each hospice built along the Hajj routes, was a monument to survival. Inscriptions often invoked mercy and healing. On one surviving stone in Cairo's Old Quarter, dated to 1375, a donor's words are still legible, built in gratitude for deliverance from the great pestilence, that those who thirst may drink and remember. Though far from Mecca, this inscription spoke to the same sentiment that guided the rebuilding of the holy city. That remembrance was not mourning alone, but gratitude. In the literary world, memory took a different form. Writers, scholars, and poets across the Islamic world turned to the pen as a way to understand what they had endured. Their words became both record and reflection. In Mecca, storytellers recited the chronicles of the plague during the quiet nights of the pilgrimage season. They did not speak of horror for its own sake, but to remind pilgrims of faith's endurance. The tales began not with numbers or geography, but with the voice of experience. There was a year, they would say, when the Kaaba stood alone and the world trembled, and yet the dawn still rose. Such recitations spread outward along the pilgrim roads. By the 15th century, versions of the story were being told in Damascus, Cairo, and even Istanbul. To hear them was to feel connected to all who had once suffered and survived. The chroniclers themselves often blended observation with theology. Al-Makrizi, in his later works, reflected that the plague revealed the frailty of man and the perfection of divine order. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani compiled Badl al-Man fi Fadl al-Tan, a monumental work on the religious dimensions of plague. He gathered hadiths, scholarly opinions, and accounts from across the Muslim world, including Mecca, shaping them into a text that bridged faith and knowledge. Through these writings, the memory of the Black Death became not only a historical event but a moral landscape, a reminder that knowledge and faith were companions, not rivals. In the centuries that followed, the story of the plague that reached Mecca became a part of a larger cultural memory. Sufi poets used it as a metaphor for purification, where the sickness of the body mirrored the sickness of the soul, and endurance became a path to divine nearness. In one Persian poem of the 15th century, the plague is called the unseen teacher. The poet writes, "It took from us the proud and left the humble standing, and in that silence, we heard the truth that prayer alone cannot hide." In the Arabic lands, poets of the Hejaz and Yemen composed qasidas, odes, mourning the lost pilgrims and praising those who had died on sacred soil. Some were inscribed on gravestones near Mina and Arafat, their verses simple and haunting. He came to seek forgiveness, and found it in the dust of Mecca. These epitaphs turned tragedy into faith's highest expression. Beyond poetry, the plague reshaped language itself. In the chronicles of the Mamluk and Ottoman eras, phrases like Sanat al-Tan, the year of the plague, or Fi Zaman al-Waba, in the time of pestilence, became markers in time, used the way modern history uses before and after. For many, the world before 1348 felt like a different age. A more innocent one. The years after were shadowed by new awareness. This shift appeared in religious thought as well. Scholars began to write more about destiny, the fragility of life, and the necessity of compassion. Charity expanded. Hospitals became more structured. Hygiene was discussed not only as health but as worship. The plague had, in its cruelty, deepened the meaning of mercy. In Mecca, decades passed, and new generations came to the Kaaba knowing the story only from their elders' lips. Yet they still felt its weight. The city's records, carefully kept by custodians of the Haram, show a rise in charitable endowments for the poor and sick. Even as wealth returned through trade, humility remained in the city's soul. The architecture of Mecca changed too. The marble of the sanctuary was repaired and polished. Narrow streets were widened to allow freer passage of air, a response to the old belief that stagnant air bred disease. Bathhouses and water cisterns were rebuilt, their use encouraged by imams who now preached that cleanliness was both a shield and a prayer. Pilgrims who came in the 15th century often remarked that Mecca had the purest air and cleanest water in Arabia, a conscious transformation born from memory. And yet, the story of the plague did not fade into mere history. It remained a quiet echo, repeated in the hearts of those who walked the same roads their ancestors had taken through fear and faith. Each generation retold it differently. Sometimes as warning, sometimes as miracle. The historian al-Sakawi wrote in the late 15th century that the year when the pestilence reached the house of God should be remembered, so that men may know how easily the world bends, and how surely it endures. His words were copied and recopied, carried across centuries by scholars and travelers alike. Even in distant lands, when later plagues appeared, imams and rulers would recall Mecca's endurance. They cited it as proof that calamity could strike the holiest places, and still faith would stand. The memory of the Black Death had thus become part of Mecca's identity, an unseen layer beneath its stones, whispering to those who came to pray. For the pilgrims, walking through the sacred precinct was not only a journey through geography, it was a journey through time. Each step echoed with the prayers of those who had walked before, through life and through death, bound by the same faith that had carried them across the desert's endless silence. Centuries passed. The dust of time softened the memory of the first great pestilence, yet the echoes of the Black Death continued to shape the sacred city. By the 16th century, Mecca was no longer a lonely oasis surrounded by tribal lands. It had become the heart of a vast world, connected by the arteries of empire. The Ottoman banners now flew over the Hejaz, and the Sultan of Istanbul called himself Qadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain, the servant of the two holy sanctuaries. From the shores of the Bosphorus to the deserts of Arabia, the faith was bound together not only by devotion, but by administration, by road, and by law. And yet, even the might of empire could not silence the oldest fear that lingered beneath the city's prayers: the return of the plague. In the early Ottoman centuries, outbreaks of disease still flickered through the trade routes. They came by caravan from Yemen, by ship from India, by pilgrim from Egypt or Syria. Each new rumor was met with a hush. Mecca, though now more organized, was still vulnerable, the crossroads of the faithful and the path of contagion alike. Ottoman records from the 16th and 17th centuries tell of repeated closures of the city gates, of quarantines along the Red Sea, and of officials sent from Cairo or Jeddah to enforce health decrees. The imperial bureaucracy had learned to respond swiftly. But the tone of these records is striking. Every directive ends not in panic, but in prayer. A letter preserved in the archives of Topkapi Palace, dated 1581, written by a governor of Jeddah to the imperial court, reads, "We have received word that a pestilence approaches from the south. The caravans are halted, the ships delayed. Yet the house of God stands, and those within trust in his will. We ask for physicians, but more than that, we ask for mercy." This blend of administration and faith became the Ottoman style of crisis, practical but never devoid of devotion. In Mecca itself, the sanctity of the city demanded special care. No armed soldiers were permitted within the haram, and so the duty of managing health fell to scholars, physicians, and local notables. They advised calm and cleanliness. Markets were regulated. Bathhouses were inspected. Wells were purified with lime and salt. For the first time, written manuals on plague etiquette circulated among pilgrims, short guides instructing travelers to wash hands often, to avoid crowds when ill, to cover the mouth when coughing. They did not yet speak the language of modern medicine, but they spoke the language of discipline and care. And above all, they reminded, "Fear not the illness, but the loss of faith." These guides, copied in neat Arabic script, were sold beside prayer beads and Zamzam bottles in the crowded lanes near the Grand Mosque. A pilgrim could buy both, a vial of holy water and a scroll of advice, and feel doubly protected. But the Ottoman world was vast, and its veins of trade carried both blessings and danger. Ships from the Indian Ocean brought spices, silk, and disease. When plague struck Cairo, it was said to arrive months later in Jeddah, and sometimes even Mecca itself. One chronicler of the 17th century, Al-Faisai al-Makki, recorded a grim year when the Kaaba's courtyard fell silent again. It was as though the angels themselves had withdrawn. The imams recited prayers in near-empty rows. The muezzin's call echoed over streets without echo. Yet, the same account speaks of an extraordinary event. During that outbreak, the residents of Mecca formed human chains to distribute food to those in isolation, leaving baskets at doorways, speaking through closed shutters. No one was to starve, even in sickness. That act of compassion became legend, a living echo of the lessons learned centuries before. By the 18th century, Ottoman medicine had begun to change. From Istanbul, physicians trained in Galenic and Islamic traditions began to exchange ideas with European doctors. Discussions of miasma and airborne corruption mingled with older notions of divine trial. Mecca, though distant, benefited from these exchanges. One famous physician, Ahmad al-Dagestani, served both in Cairo and Mecca. In his treatise Al-Tib fi al-Haramain, Medicine in the Two Sanctuaries, written around 1750, he argued that clean air and open courtyards are acts of faith as well as health. He recommended boiling water, burning incense to purify rooms, and maintaining distance from the sick, all practices that centuries later would echo in modern public health. Still, every instruction began with the phrase, Bismillah al-Rahman al-Rahim, in the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Science was never divorced from spirit. It was its servant. As the 18th century drew toward the 19th, Mecca entered a new rhythm. The Hajj had grown immense. Caravans from every province of the Ottoman Empire converged each year. From Damascus, from Cairo, from Tunis and Delhi. The roads thrummed with life, and the air was alive with the murmur of countless tongues. But with the pilgrims came new risks. Cholera began to appear in the 1820s, spreading swiftly along the same sacred routes once taken by the Black Death. For Mecca, this was a new plague, but the city met it with an old wisdom. Faith and vigilance entwined. Ottoman engineers built new cisterns and aqueducts to bring clean water to the pilgrims' quarters. The Sheikh al-Haram, guardian of the holy precinct, enforced strict sanitation measures. Prayers for protection were added to the Friday sermons. And once again, just as in the 14th century, the story of the earlier plague was told anew. Preachers reminded the faithful. Our ancestors faced the pestilence and did not despair. They cleansed their homes, prayed, and stood together. And God preserved them, as He shall preserve us. Thus memory became medicine once more. By the late 19th century, Western travelers began to record what they saw in Mecca. One British physician, Richard Burton, who entered the city in disguise in 1853, noted that the people of Mecca, though deeply religious, are practical in their precautions. He described the burning of aromatic wood, the washing of streets, and the quarantines at Jeddah. He concluded, almost in awe, "It is a faith that does not deny fear but transforms it into discipline." This observation, though written by an outsider, captured the essence of Mecca's resilience, the same spirit that had survived the Black Death 5 centuries before. As the 19th century closed, the modern world arrived at the city's gates. Telegraphs, steamships, and new medical missions. But even then, the old story still lived. When new outbreaks came, elders told the young, "This is not the first time the city has been tested. The house of God has seen darker nights, and yet the dawn always comes." That belief, rooted in memory, sanctified by centuries, became Mecca's unbroken heartbeat. The dawn of the 20th century brought new sounds to Mecca. The rhythm of camel bells still echoed through the desert, but now it mingled with the hiss of steamships and the clatter of telegraph lines. The world had grown smaller. Journeys that once took months were now measured in days. And though speed brought convenience, it also brought a new and terrible efficiency to the spread of disease. The old pestilence had never truly vanished. It had simply changed its face. The word plague gave way to new names: cholera, typhus, influenza. But to those who remembered the stories of the 14th century, they were all shades of the same shadow. And Mecca, still the beating heart of the Muslim world, stood once more at the crossroads of contagion and faith. In 1865, the world turned its eyes toward the Hejaz again. That year, a massive cholera outbreak erupted during the Hajj pilgrimage. It began with pilgrims arriving from India, where the disease was already raging. Within days, the infection spread among the tents and narrow lanes of Mecca. The intense heat, the scarcity of clean water, and the sheer density of pilgrims turned the holy city into a place of silent fear. Eyewitness accounts describe the horror with stark simplicity. One Ottoman report stated, "Men fell in prayer and did not rise again. The streets grew quiet as the grave." From Mecca, the disease traveled with the departing pilgrims, to Medina, to Jeddah, across the Red Sea to Egypt, and onward to Europe. Within months, the Mecca cholera had reached as far as Paris and London. It was one of the first global health crises of the modern age. Western newspapers, often with little understanding of the sacred nature of the pilgrimage, published alarmist headlines. Some accused the Hajj itself of being a highway of plague. But in the Islamic world the reaction was different. Leaders, scholars, and physicians gathered not to condemn the pilgrimage, but to reform its management. In Constantinople, the Ottoman government established a permanent Hajj health office, a bureau tasked with monitoring the safety of the pilgrimage routes. For the first time, modern quarantine stations were built along the Red Sea coast. Ships carrying pilgrims from India and Southeast Asia were required to stop at Cameron Island, where travelers were inspected, their belongings fumigated, and the sick treated in isolation wards. These were new methods, born of science rather than superstition, but they carried an old spirit of duty. Ottoman officials called it hifz al-siha, the protection of health, a concept that echoed the earlier Islamic ideals of cleanliness and preservation of life. In Mecca itself, wells were cleaned and widened. Waste management systems were introduced. During the Hajj, inspectors, known as Mushrif al-Siha, moved through the camps, ensuring that no stagnant water was left standing, no meat was left to rot, and no pilgrims went without water in the heat. The transformation was gradual, but it was real. The holy city was learning to live with modernity without losing its sanctity. The cholera years did not come only once. In 1883-1893, and again in the early 20th century, the epidemic returned. Each time the measures improved, and the death toll lessened. Each time Mecca's resilience grew stronger. By the 1920s, the newly formed kingdom of Hejaz, soon to become part of modern Saudi Arabia, continued the Ottoman legacy of public health reform. King Abdulaziz ibn Saud recognized that the safety of pilgrims was the foundation of the city's honor. He invited Egyptian and British physicians to advise on sanitation. Hospitals were constructed near the Grand Mosque. Wells were tested for contamination. The changes were not merely physical, they were deeply cultural. For centuries, the idea of purity in Mecca had been spiritual. Now it became scientific as well. The faithful began to see hygiene not as a foreign concept, but as a form of worship. By the mid-20th century, the old fear of plague had taken on a new language. Doctors spoke of bacteria and viruses. Preachers spoke of patience and trust. Both, in their own way, were addressing the same truth, that the city's safety was a shared responsibility. When global health conferences met in Geneva and Cairo, Mecca was always part of the discussion. The pilgrimage, with its millions of travelers, had become a focus for international cooperation. In 1957, the World Health Organization officially partnered with Saudi authorities to monitor infectious diseases during Hajj. This was a quiet but monumental moment, the union of modern science with one of humanity's oldest spiritual journeys. Through all these changes, the memory of the Black Death remained, muted but not forgotten. Scholars continued to tell the story of the 14th century, when the desert winds carried the unseen terror into the heart of the Holy Land. They told of the graves beyond the city walls, the prayers said beneath the black shroud of disease, and the lessons learned in patience and mercy. To many Meccans, the modern epidemics were not something new but rather revisits of the same trial. One elderly scholar, writing in 1934, put it simply, "Each age has its plague, but Mecca endures, because its foundation is not stone but faith." By the time airplanes began bringing pilgrims from across continents, the Hajj had become a marvel of logistics and health management. Vaccinations, quarantine procedures, and international medical missions all formed a network of vigilance. And yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the call to prayer echoed through the marble courtyards, the spirit of those who had suffered centuries before still seemed to linger. For every pilgrim who knelt before the Kaaba, there was an unspoken awareness that the sanctity of life and the act of worship were inseparable, that the city had faced the worst the world could bring, and had survived, purified by its own endurance. The plague that reached Mecca had long since passed into legend, but its shadow had shaped everything that came after. The architecture of the city, the laws of the empire, the rituals of cleanliness, and the very consciousness of faith itself. In that way, the Black Death never truly died. It lived on, in better hospitals, in cleaner wells, in the wisdom of those who refused to separate science from sanctity. It became not a curse, but a memory, a teacher that had whispered across centuries, "Preserve life, and you preserve the prayer." The 20th century matured into the 21st, and Mecca's skyline changed in ways no earlier pilgrim could have imagined. Marble replaced mud brick. Minarets rose higher than any before them. The old streets, once narrow and dust-filled, became polished avenues where millions of pilgrims moved in rhythm, each step echoing centuries of devotion. Yet beneath this new brilliance, an ancient instinct still guided the city's pulse, the instinct to guard life, to remember the lessons of the plague that had once reached its heart. By the late 1970s, Mecca had become one of the most complex pilgrimage destinations on Earth. Every year, over 1 million people arrived from across continents, by plane, ship, and highway. They came bearing the same faith as their ancestors who had once crossed deserts and seas, but now they carried vaccination certificates, health clearances, and medical records. These requirements were not born of bureaucracy. They were born of memory. They were the modern descendants of those first cautious steps taken centuries earlier, when plague and cholera had shadowed the pilgrimage roads. The Saudi government, inheriting both the legacy of faith and the burden of history, turned to science as its guardian. The Ministry of Health created specialized departments for the Hajj, planning every detail of safety, from clean water distribution to crowd medicine, from heatstroke prevention to epidemic surveillance. Hospitals were built along the routes to Arafat, Mina, and Muzdalifah. Dozens of mobile clinics were stationed at every major junction of the pilgrimage. Ambulances stood ready day and night, engines humming softly in the background as millions of prayers rose into the desert air. And in every protocol, every inspection, every vial of water tested for purity, one could trace the faint outline of the past, the memory of the time when the holy city had faced its darkest night. The new century would test that memory once more. In 2003, the world trembled before the sudden rise of SARS, a virus that traveled from one continent to another with terrifying speed. For Saudi Arabia, it was a warning echo from history. Officials remembered the stories of the Black Death, the cholera years, the Mecca outbreaks that had once reshaped global health policy. And so, in response, they acted with precision and restraint. For the first time, electronic thermal scanners were placed at airports. Pilgrims arriving from affected regions were monitored closely. Medical officers stood at the border checkpoints, quietly observing, recording, and advising. It was the same ancient vigilance, reborn in modern form. Science wearing the soul of faith. Then came the year 2009, and the world faced another invisible storm. H1N1 influenza. Once again, Mecca prepared. Vaccinations were made mandatory. Special health advisories were issued through embassies and mosques across the world. Every pilgrim received guidance, not only on prayer and ritual, but on cleanliness, hydration, and hygiene. For some, these instructions seemed simple, but to those who understood the history of the city, they carried deep significance. Each act of care was an echo of survival. Each mask, each drop of disinfectant, each barrier placed around the Kaaba during cleaning, all were continuations of a story that began when the first plague crossed the desert in the 14th century. And then, in 2020, the most profound modern test arrived. The COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe like a shadow of the ancient Black Death. Airports closed, cities fell silent, and for the first time in living memory, the pilgrimage was halted. The sight was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. The Kaaba, usually surrounded by waves of pilgrims, now encircled by a small group of masked workers sanitizing its marble floors beneath the dim lights of an empty courtyard. The world watched in silence. Images of Mecca's stillness traveled across continents, through television, through screens, through hearts. To many, it was a scene of sorrow. But to historians, to believers, to those who remembered the chronicles of Ibn Battuta, Ibn al-Wardi, and al-Makrizi, it was a scene of continuity. For this was not the first time the sacred city had fallen quiet for the sake of life. In the 14th century they had closed the roads to contain the Black Death. In the 19th, they had restricted the Hajj to halt cholera. And now, in the 21st, they paused again, not out of fear, but out of reverence for life itself. Inside Saudi Arabia, health workers became the new guardians of the haram. Doctors, nurses, and cleaners, many from distant lands, worked night and day to keep the city safe. Their voices were calm, their gestures steady. In their movements there was something almost devotional. They were continuing the same mission that had guided scholars and physicians for centuries: to protect the living so that worship might continue. When the Hajj resumed, limited and controlled, it was unlike any before it. Pilgrims moved in small groups, maintaining distance, wearing masks, guided by floor markings and medical staff. It was a new kind of ritual, one that wove science into faith so seamlessly that the two became inseparable. Observers noted how quiet the atmosphere was, how dignified, how gentle. Even amid the pandemic, the sanctity of the pilgrimage was preserved. And perhaps in that quiet, one could hear the faint echo of an older silence, the silence that had once fallen over Mecca during the Black Death. The memory of the plague that reached Mecca is no longer told as fear, it is told as wisdom. Today, when Saudi medical students study epidemiology, when public health officials prepare for the next Hajj, they do so under the unspoken guidance of history. They study ancient accounts not as curiosities, but as reminders. That faith without preparation is fragile, and that knowledge without humility is blind. The city has become a symbol not only of devotion but of resilience. Its marble courtyards hold the memory of every test the world has sent its way, of plague, of cholera, of pandemic. And each time the same pattern repeats: preparation, prayer, and patience. The air of Mecca carries that legacy still. Every pilgrim who breathes it, knowingly or not, shares in a story that began 7 centuries ago, when a dark wind blew from the north and carried an unseen terror into the holiest city on earth. Today, Mecca stands as a living monument not only to faith, but to endurance. Its hospitals, its sanitation systems, its quarantine centers, these are not merely tools of medicine. They are the architecture of remembrance. They are the continuation of the vow first made in the age of the Black Death, that no calamity, however vast, would erase the light of the city that never ceases to pray. Listen closely now. The year is around 1349. Across the desert, where wind draws lines upon the sand, travelers once again set their eyes upon Mecca, the sacred heart of Islam. But the world has changed. By now, the great pestilence had walked from China through Samarkand, through the Persian lands, through Mesopotamia, and had reached Syria and Egypt. No caravan came untouched. No road was clean. Even the scent of spices, once sweet and thick in the air, carried a whisper of sickness. Along the old pilgrim routes, from Cairo, from Damascus, from Baghdad, men and women still journeyed. Some came out of devotion, others out of habit. Some believed the holy city itself might offer protection from the plague that burned through towns like unseen fire. They wrapped their faces with cloths soaked in rosewater and vinegar. They traveled in small groups. They whispered verses for protection as they crossed the dunes. And yet, the illness followed, slow, invisible, certain. Imagine a caravan nearing Mecca. The sky is clear, the sun merciless. Camels sway with their loads. A child coughs, the sound dry and weak. Her mother hushes her, believing it to be dust. But by the time they reach the valley near Jeddah, 2 more pilgrims have fallen behind, fevered, shivering though the heat burns their skin. They are carried on mats, beneath the shadow of date palms. By morning one of them no longer breathes. Such was the way the plague arrived. Not with armies but with faith. Not with war but with worship. Each year's pilgrimage was a tapestry of nations. Persians, Egyptians, Africans, Turks, Indians. Each road was a thread that carried not only devotion but disease. In the great city of Cairo, where the caravan began, the Black Death had already taken tens of thousands. Chroniclers like al-Makrizi described houses filled with silence. Funerals stretched in endless lines. And yet, even there, the call to Hajj was not silenced. For many, to die on the journey was a noble fate, a martyr's rest. So the caravans left, even as the Nile's waters seemed to mourn the dead. They moved south toward the Red Sea, their banners fluttering like pale ghosts in the wind. Through the barren mountains of the Hejaz they passed. The sun bleached their skin, the sand burned their feet. And behind them, the shadow of the plague followed, creeping through every oasis and stop. In Mecca, the first signs came quietly. A fever among the traders near the Egyptian gate. A merchant coughing blood. A child fainting at the well of Zamzam. At first, the locals believed it was heat stroke, or exhaustion from travel. But within weeks, the number grew. Then the truth spread, whispered from mouth to mouth like a secret too heavy to hold. The pestilence has entered Mecca. Historians tell us that in 1349, and again in 1351, the city saw its deadliest waves. Even those who sought refuge in prayer could not escape the invisible tide. The plague did not respect sacred walls or holy ground. It entered homes and mosques alike, moving silently between the faithful. Chroniclers in Arabia and Egypt wrote that the air itself seemed poisoned. Birds flew differently. Dogs wandered in packs through empty alleys. The Kaaba stood surrounded by silence, as the crowds thinned. Imams led funeral prayers every hour, their voices soft and trembling. In the markets, once so vibrant, only echoes remained, the faint clatter of wooden doors in the hot wind. And yet, amid that desolation, faith endured. Men still circled the Kaaba, weak and weeping. Women still offered water to the sick. Some physicians, trained in the traditions of Ibn Sina and al-Razi, mixed medicines of vinegar and myrrh, hoping to cleanse the air. They burned incense of sandalwood and frankincense, believing smoke could chase away the miasma. They washed the sick with water from the Zamzam well, its purity a comfort, if not a cure. It is said that the people of Mecca accepted the plague not as wrath, but as trial. They believed it to be a purification, a test of endurance, faith, and surrender. The sermons spoke not of despair, but of patience. For every soul that departed, another prayer rose. The rhythm of life and death became one with the rhythm of devotion. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. The vast courtyard of the Grand Mosque under a burning sun. The marble stones hot under bare feet. The air shimmering. Around the Kaaba, circles of pilgrims still move. Slower, weaker, yet unwavering. Their faces pale, their garments dusty. Their eyes fixed upon the black-draped cube that has stood through every storm of time. And from the minarets, the call to prayer still rises. Soft, trembling, yet certain. The voice echoes through the hollow city, carrying a strange beauty. A fragile defiance against the plague that devours all else. By the end of that season, thousands had perished. The desert winds carried their names away, but Mecca endured. And as the survivors buried their dead, they whispered words of gratitude. For having reached the city, for having prayed, for having stood, even once, in the presence of the sacred. The plague had reached Mecca. But Mecca, in its stillness, had absorbed the storm. The year after the plague's arrival in Mecca, the desert grew quiet. Caravans that once thundered through the sands now moved hesitantly, their bells muted by cloth. From Cairo to Damascus, traders whispered of the Hajj that never was. Too many were gone. Too many roads had become haunted by memory. The chronicles of Ibn Kathir and al-Makrizi speak softly of those years. They tell of how the Hajj caravans, mighty columns of camels and pilgrims that had crossed the desert for centuries, dwindled into small, uncertain groups. The Sultan of Egypt, who traditionally sponsored the great caravan to Mecca, found fewer souls willing to join. In Damascus, the caravan court stood half empty. The call for pilgrims echoed, unanswered. The Black Death had not only claimed lives, it had broken the rhythm of devotion. The Hajj was more than worship. It was the heartbeat of the Islamic world. Merchants, scholars, and travelers mingled there. Ideas flowed as freely as water. Now that flow had slowed to a trickle. In Mecca itself, the aftermath was visible in every street. The houses once crowded with pilgrims stood shuttered. Markets where spices and silks from India and Africa were traded had fallen silent. The air carried the faint scent of disinfectants, vinegar, camphor, and incense, that people still burned out of habit and fear. Even after the worst had passed, the city lived cautiously. The plague, people said, never truly left. It only slept. And so the Meccans learned to live beside it, a constant, invisible neighbor. In the cool hours before dawn, when the wind carried the scent of sand and stone, the caretakers of the Haram, the sacred mosque, would sweep its courtyard in silence. Their brooms moved softly across marble, pushing away dust and memory alike. Some of them had buried their families only months before. Still they came each morning barefoot, whispering prayers as they worked. Imagine those moments. The sound of bristles on stone, the call of a single bird in the still air, and the Kaaba standing at the center, dark, unmoving, eternal. Outside the city, the desert reclaimed what man had built. Small pilgrim lodges turned to ruin. Wells dried, their stones cracked by the sun. In distant oases, people told stories of the silent pilgrimage, the years when the holy roads lay empty. Even so, not all was despair. In Medina, scholars began recording the lessons learned, not only of disease but of destiny. They wrote of contagion, of the balance between faith and reason, of how illness could pass from man to man though unseen. Some quoted the words of the Prophet, "If you hear of a plague in a land, do not enter it. If it occurs where you are, do not leave." For the first time, such guidance was understood not just as divine command, but also as a kind of early quarantine, a mercy hidden within wisdom. And across the Islamic world, from Andalusia to Samarkand, the idea of quarantine began to take root. Ports in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean built isolation zones for incoming ships. Doctors spoke of Taun, the plague, as something both spiritual and natural, requiring prayer and care alike. The science of medicine, long cherished by Arab scholars, adapted to this unseen foe. But for Mecca, recovery was slow. The sacred city depended on the lifeblood of pilgrims. Without them, the economy faltered. The once busy hostels, ribots, were turned into shelters for the poor. Many families who had served the pilgrims for generations now found themselves destitute. Still, Mecca remained what it had always been, the heart of Islam. And like a heart that slows but never stops, it continued to beat. The first year the caravans resumed, historians say it was around 1352, was one of cautious joy. A small group arrived from Egypt, thinner and wearier than before. They entered the city under banners still stained with dust from the road. Their prayers filled the air once more. Tears mixed with the sand beneath their feet. Locals watched them circle the Kaaba, remembering the years of emptiness. The muezzins' voices trembled with emotion as they called the adhan. Every sound seemed sacred again. The rustle of cloth, the echo of sandals on stone, the soft hum of verses recited under breath. Beyond the mosque walls, the desert listened. It had witnessed empires rise and fall, caravans come and go. Now it bore silent witness to the endurance of faith itself. In the years that followed, the memory of the plague lingered. Stories passed from traveler to traveler, each one describing how the great pestilence had touched even the holiest place on earth. They spoke of the pilgrims who died on the road, of the mothers who buried children near Jeddah, of the scholars who prayed over the sick until their own voices failed. And always the story ended the same way, with the resilience of Mecca. For though the plague had come and gone, the city endured. It had faced fire, siege, famine, and now disease. And every time it rose again. The Kaaba still stood, its black cloth gleaming beneath the sun. The call to prayer still echoed through the mountains. The faith of millions still pointed toward it. Centuries would pass, and new generations would walk the same roads. Few would remember the fear that once gripped the desert, or the silence that fell over the holy city. But the records remain, in the writings of scholars, in the memories of families, in the pulse of history itself. The plague had reached Mecca, yes, But Mecca had reached through the plague and survived. When the fever finally loosened its hold, Mecca began to breathe again. The winds that once carried whispers of death now brought only the dry scent of sand and date palms. The Kaaba stood untouched, its black drapery renewed by pilgrims who had survived the plague's long shadow. But the people of the Hejaz were changed. Those who lived through the great pestilence carried in their hearts both gratitude and grief. Every street bore memory. Every prayer held the echo of names lost. And yet, amidst that quiet mourning, a deeper reflection took root, an awareness that faith and reason were not rivals, but twin lights guiding through darkness. In the years that followed, scholars gathered in the cool courtyards of Mecca and Medina. They debated softly about the meaning of what had passed. Was the plague a test of faith, or a natural calamity written by divine decree? Could prayer alone protect, or must wisdom and precaution walk beside it? Among them were physicians trained in the tradition of Ibn Sina, al-Razi, and Ibn al-Khatib. They spoke of contagion, adwa, the unseen passage of illness from one body to another. Some quoted the words of the Prophet, "Flee from the leper as you would flee from the lion." Others answered that no soul could escape what God had written. In their quiet disagreements, something remarkable was born. The earliest seeds of public health in the Islamic world. Those discussions, preserved in manuscripts now scattered across libraries in Cairo, Istanbul, and Fez, reveal a delicate balance. They show a civilization that refused to choose between faith and knowledge. Instead, it wove them together. Mecca, as the crossroads of the Muslim world, became the meeting place for these ideas. Pilgrims from far lands, Andalusia, Yemen, Persia, India, came not only for prayer but to share remedies, theories, and practices. One might bring a powder of dried rose petals. Another, a vinegar tincture mixed with saffron. Each claimed healing properties. Some methods worked. Others were mere comfort for fearful hearts. The mutasib, the city inspector responsible for public order and hygiene, began enforcing new customs. Markets were cleaned more regularly. Water cellars were required to boil and cover their jars. Bathhouses, once seen as luxuries, became places of both cleansing and protection. The desert itself became a kind of physician. People learned to trust its dry air, to rest in open courtyards where the wind moved freely. Sick travelers were often guided to small tents beyond the city walls, an early form of isolation that echoed the quarantine measures of distant Venice and Constantinople. Even architecture began to shift. Homes were built with wider windows, courtyards more open to air. In mosques, the marble floors were polished smoother, easier to wash. Every gesture, every design whispered the same silent lesson. Cleanliness was not just beauty, it was survival. Outside Mecca, across the vast lands of Islam, the plague left its mark on thought itself. In Cairo, historians began to chronicle not only the reigns of sultans but the years of disease. In Damascus, poets wrote elegies for entire neighborhoods gone silent. In Yemen, traders began recording health conditions of ports in their travel logs, noting which towns were clean or town-struck. For the first time, health became a shared language, as essential to trade and pilgrimage as routes and rations. And yet, through all these changes, the spiritual core remained untouched. To the faithful, the plague had been a reminder that life was a fleeting trust, that prayer and compassion mattered even in the face of despair. Mosques filled again. Charitable kitchens reopened, feeding widows and orphans left by the pestilence. In the evenings after prayer, people gathered beneath lanterns to listen to recitations from the Quran, their voices trembling but steady. One chronicler from Medina, writing in 1363, described the city as a place washed by tears but lit by faith. He wrote of how survivors treated strangers with newfound gentleness, for everyone had lost someone. He described how the sick were no longer shunned but cared for, how travelers were offered bread and dates at every gate, how, in a strange way, the plague had stripped the world of arrogance. And still, Mecca remained the symbol of endurance. Its hills had seen centuries of storms, wars, droughts, famines, and now disease. But the Kaaba stood steady as ever. When the next caravans came, they found the city ready, its streets swept, its wells filled. The people had learned, adapted, endured. Even in distant lands, news of Mecca's survival brought hope. In Granada, scholars copied Meccan accounts to remind their students that faith could outlast fear. In Delhi, poets used the plague as a metaphor for worldly trials, and Mecca as the symbol of divine constancy. Through every retelling, the lesson spread. Holiness did not promise safety, but it gave meaning to suffering. Picture it now. The desert at twilight. A thin crescent moon rising over the mountains of Tihama. The city below glowing faintly with oil lamps. From the minarets, the call to prayer drifts. Soft, ancient, certain. The same call that had sounded through the darkest years still echoes across the sand. And those who hear it pause, breathe, and remember that the plague had once reached even the holiest place on earth, but it could not silence its faith. The years after the plague saw the desert roads stir again, slowly, carefully, like a patient waking from fever. Where silence had reigned, the sound of caravan bells returned, muted by distance but steady. From Cairo, from Damascus, from Sana'a, small groups once more traced the ancient paths to Mecca. But the world they crossed was not the same. The Black Death had redrawn the map of life. Entire towns that once hosted travelers had vanished. Oases lay abandoned, their wells filled with sand. Old trade routes, once busy with camels laden with silk, pepper, and incense, were now deserted, not out of disuse but out of fear. The Great Red Sea corridor, linking Egypt to Arabia, had been one of the arteries of both commerce and pilgrimage. Now, sailors hesitated to dock at ports rumored to have been struck by Taun, the plague. Ships arriving from Aden, Jeddah, or Suez were inspected from afar. Their crews watched for signs of sickness. A single cough could bring an entire harbor to stillness. Yet necessity is stronger than fear. The world's faiths and economies depended on these roads. So, new practices emerged, quiet, cautious innovations that would one day evolve into the global health systems we know today. In the ports of the Red Sea, merchants and governors began enforcing 40-day waits for foreign ships. No goods could be unloaded. No sailors could step ashore until the time had passed. They called it arabian, 40, a number that would echo centuries later as quarantine. Though the term was Italian in origin, the practice existed in Arabic lands first, born of necessity and observation. In Mecca, these measures saved lives. The pilgrims who arrived by sea from Africa and Yemen were watched carefully. Those showing fever or swelling were isolated in tents beyond the city walls. The physicians who tended them used perfumes and herbs, basil, rue, myrrh, not as cures, but as protection against what they called bad air. And always they prayed. Trade adapted too. The caravans that once traveled shoulder to shoulder now spread out, each group keeping distance from the next. At night, camps were set farther apart. The merchants of Egypt and the Hejaz began to favor smaller caravans. Faster, less crowded, easier to manage. The great bustling convoys of 1,000 camels gave way to quieter, leaner processions. In Damascus, where the Hajj caravan began each year under the banner of the Sultan, the departure ceremony changed. Gone were the crowds that once filled the city gates to bless the travelers. Now, families said their farewells from a distance, waving silently as the long line of pilgrims disappeared into the golden haze. The plague had changed not only the movement of bodies but the rhythm of belief. Before, the Hajj was a symbol of unity, millions converging upon one sacred center. After the pestilence, it became also a symbol of endurance, a journey that could not be stopped even by death itself. Through all these changes, Mecca remained the heart of the system, a fixed point in a shifting world. Caravans came fewer, but their devotion was greater. Traders brought less silk, but more humility. Every road that led to the city now carried the weight of remembrance. And yet, the world outside the desert did not heal so easily. In Egypt, population loss transformed entire provinces. Fields lay unharvested. Irrigation canals clogged with silt. In Syria, mosques stood half empty for years, their imams buried in mass graves beyond the city walls. But trade like faith found a way. The Mamluks, rulers of Egypt and protectors of the holy cities, rebuilt their networks. They repaired wells along the Hajj route, stationed guards at key stops, and established new resting points where fresh water could be drawn. In these rest houses, weary travelers found not only food and shade but also inspection, a simple questioning by guards about illness or fever. This was not cruelty, but wisdom learned through loss. Even the sacred rituals of pilgrimage reflected that new awareness. Where once the crowds pressed close around the Kaaba, now imams urged restraint. Worshippers were advised to perform tawaf, the circling of the Kaaba, in smaller groups. Public sermons included not just calls for repentance, but lessons in hygiene. "Wash your hands before you eat," one preacher wrote in his notes from 1353, "for cleanliness is half of faith." In time, the Hajj returned to its full grandeur. But the memory of those years never left the people of the Hejaz. Parents told their children of the days when the roads were silent. Old men in the markets spoke of the time when Mecca's wells ran clear but the streets were empty. The story of the plague became a lesson, a warning written into the collective memory of Islam. And beyond faith, something else had shifted, a kind of humility before the unseen forces of the world. Merchants, scholars, rulers, all had learned that no wall, no crown, no wealth could shield against what moved through the air. What remained was the small, enduring strength of care, the washing of hands, the sharing of water, the kindness of a neighbor. Even centuries later, when new plagues came, chroniclers would recall the old one. They would write, "This is as it was in the year when the pestilence reached Mecca." And those who heard it would bow their heads, remembering the silent caravans, the shuttered gates, and the faith that endured beneath the black cloth of the Kaaba. Now imagine the desert once more. Vast, endless, quiet. The stars above shimmer as they did in every century. Far below, a line of pilgrims moves through the sand, their lamps flickering in the night. They do not speak of the plague. They walk, as those before them walked, toward the same horizon, toward Mecca, toward remembrance, toward the mercy of God. Long after the fever had passed, its shadow remained in the stories people told. In Mecca, in Medina, in Cairo and Damascus, memories of the Black Death lingered, whispered from generation to generation like an old prayer. It became part of the fabric of remembrance, woven into sermons, into poetry, into the cautious rhythm of everyday life. Centuries would pass, and yet the phrase, "the year of the pestilence," would still fall softly in the chronicles of Arab historians. It marked not only death but transformation. For in those dark years, the world had seen both its fragility and its endurance. The poets of the Hejaz were among the first to give the memory voice. They did not write of despair but of mercy. They described how even in the silence of Mecca's streets, the Kaaba had stood firm, a symbol of constancy amidst chaos. One verse, copied in a manuscript now preserved in Istanbul, reads, "When the world fell silent, the house of God spoke, not in words but in patience." Such lines became part of the oral tradition. Old men recited them during evening gatherings, their voices low and rhythmic, the flames of oil lamps dancing on their weathered faces. Children listened in awe, picturing the desert swallowed by dust, the caravans halted, and then, as the verses promised, life returning. The scholars too recorded their reflections. Ibn Khaldun, writing in North Africa, spoke of how the plague had reshaped societies, how it had devoured nations and diminished dynasties. He wrote that the world's structure had been shaken, population, production, and learning all altered by an invisible hand. His words, though distant from Mecca, carried the echo of that same truth. The plague had not spared the sacred. Closer to the holy city, local chroniclers took up their pens to preserve what memory might otherwise forget. They wrote of the years when the pilgrimage was suspended, when the desert roads lay empty, and when the faithful who remained within Mecca prayed not for wealth or health, but simply for dawn. In their records, the plague became more than a disease. It was a lesson in submission, in humility before fate. The sermons that followed in later centuries often began with remembrance. Imams would tell of the plague as a warning, not of wrath, but of balance. They spoke of how man must care for the body as for the soul, how knowledge and prayer must walk hand in hand. And the people listened, for they knew these were not distant tales. They were the shared memory of their ancestors. In Medina, where the Prophet was buried, storytellers found gentler ways to retell the old suffering. They spoke of the physicians who had refused to flee, of the women who tended the sick though death walked among them. They told of how neighbors shared their last water, how strangers prayed together at dusk, how even in terror compassion endured. It was said that mercy, not plague, was the final word of that era. Art and architecture, too, carried the memory. Mosques built in the later 14th century bore subtle signs of the lessons learned. Wider courtyards, better ventilation, water channels designed for cleanliness. Fountains became central not only for ritual ablution but for health. To wash was to honor life. To share water was to affirm faith. Even centuries later, travelers passing through the Hejaz would note this inherited awareness. They wrote of how Meccans preferred open-air gatherings, how homes were arranged around fresh wells and shaded corridors, how the people burned incense not for luxury but for purification. Every gesture seemed born from an ancient caution, and an ancient respect. Beyond Arabia, the story of Mecca's plague spread through the Muslim world. In Cairo, storytellers in the Khan al-Khalili markets recited tales of the Hajj of silence, when only a handful of pilgrims had reached the city. In Persia, poets compared the endurance of Mecca to that of a lover who waits through a long night of separation. In West Africa, scholars teaching in Timbuktu would mention the event to remind students of the fragility of human plans before divine will. And always the story ended the same way. Not with ruin but with return. Mecca survived. The faith continued. The roads filled once more with caravans, their bells ringing like faint music across the sand. Imagine now, centuries later, a pilgrim standing before the Kaaba. He lifts his hands in prayer, unaware of the thousands who stood there before him, through plague, famine, and fear. The marble beneath his feet has known tears and dust and time. And though the city has changed, new walls, new lights, new names, the same stillness lingers in the air. The wind that moves through the colonnades carries the scent of musk and desert stone, the same scent the survivors once breathed when they thanked God for another sunrise. And somewhere in that air, the echo of those ancient prayers still floats, soft, almost inaudible, like the last sigh of a fever fading. For history is not only written in ink. It lives in the silence between breaths, in the customs we keep without knowing why, in the instinct to wash before we pray, to cover our mouths when we cough, to greet one another with peace. Thus the plague became not just a memory but a teacher. And Mecca, patient, enduring, unbroken, became its living monument. When the banners of the Ottoman Empire unfurled across the deserts of Arabia, Mecca entered a new age, an era of restoration, vigilance, and renewed devotion. The plague that once silenced its streets had long passed, but its memory still guided every act of the living. Now, under the crescent of a powerful new dynasty, the holy city prepared to breathe again, not in fear, but in harmony. The year was the early 16th century. Caravans came from all corners of the vast Ottoman lands. From Damascus, from Cairo, from the shores of the Bosporus. Each year, the Hajj caravans departed with ceremony. Long processions of camels, banners, and guards carrying water, supplies, and prayers. The sound of their bells echoed across the sand like 1,000 beating hearts. In Damascus, the journey began with a grand festival. The Emir al-Hajj, commander of the pilgrimage, stood before the people. His robes embroidered with silver, his face solemn. Before him lay the mamal, the sacred palanquin, adorned with green silk and gold, a symbol of the Sultan's blessing upon the journey. Crowds gathered to watch as the mamal was lifted onto its camel, and the drums thundered through the streets. This was not merely travel, it was faith in motion. For many, Mecca had become not only the destination of a lifetime but the center of the world's heartbeat. Every step toward it was an act of remembrance, of those who had perished in the plague, of those who had built anew. The roads that were once desolate were now alive with movement. Merchants, scholars, guards, mothers carrying infants beneath white veils, men murmuring prayers under their breath. The Ottoman sultans, proud protectors of Islam's holiest sites, invested deeply in the city's renewal. They repaired its walls, expanded the great mosque, and improved the water systems that flowed from the ancient Zamzam well. Public baths were built near the pilgrim quarters, and fountains were placed along the main roads to keep the air cool and clean. It was said that where water flows, life returns, a lesson learned from the centuries of sickness. Architects from Istanbul brought with them the Ottoman eye for beauty, arches that curved like poetry, marble that caught the desert light, courtyards filled with soft murmurs of prayer. Mecca, once wrapped in silence, now shimmered again, sacred and secure. From the minarets, the adhan, call to prayer, rose 5 times a day, echoing across the valleys like the breath of the city itself. But the Ottomans also remembered. They never forgot the invisible danger that could once again creep through the pilgrim roads. So they built quarantine stations, known as karantina, along the caravan routes, small stone forts in the wilderness where travelers rested and were inspected before continuing to Mecca. It was one of the earliest systems of health control in the Islamic world. Each pilgrim was treated as both a guest of God and a bearer of responsibility, to protect others by protecting themselves. In Mecca itself, the Sharif, descendant of the Prophet and governor of the city, worked with the Ottoman Sultan to ensure peace. He patrolled the markets, managed the influx of pilgrims, and kept the sacred precincts clean. The fragrance of burning oud and jasmine filled the narrow lanes, mingling with the voices of thousands of tongues: Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Urdu, Malay. Mecca had become a living mosaic of the Muslim world. Each year, when the Hajj reached its peak, the city glowed like a lantern in the desert night. Oil lamps lined the paths to Mount Arafat. From above, the valleys shimmered with light and movement. Men and women dressed in white, circling the Kaaba in waves like the tide itself. To stand among them was to feel time dissolve. All empires, all languages, all distances, gone. Only faith remained. Chroniclers of the time described these scenes with awe. One Ottoman traveler, Evliya Shalebi, wrote that the Kaaba gleams as though heaven itself leaned down to watch. He noted how the people of Mecca treated pilgrims as family, offering food, shelter, and water freely. It was a city of service, rebuilt upon compassion. Yet even in peace, the fear of plague never vanished entirely. Every few decades, a rumor would rise. Sickness in Yemen, fever in Egypt. The Ottomans would close the roads, isolate the caravans, and pray that the winds of the desert would spare the holy city once more. Most years they did. Sometimes they did not. But each time Mecca endured, disciplined, watchful, and unyielding. In the 18th century, during the reign of Sultan Mahmud I, Mecca's scholars wrote new guides for pilgrims, combining scripture with practical advice. How to wash hands before eating, how to store food safely, how to treat fever and cough. The book began with the words, "Cleanliness is half of faith. The other half is patience." It became a silent monument to centuries of learning born from suffering. And so, by the dawn of the 19th century, Mecca was no longer the fragile survivor of plague-ridden years. It was the beating heart of a vast empire, ordered, clean, and sacred. Its air carried the scent of incense and health. Its walls whispered the lessons of endurance. Even as the Ottomans waned and new powers rose, the city remained what it had always been, a mirror of faith, reflecting humanity's struggle to rise from darkness toward light. The caravans would continue until the modern age, until trains, ships, and airplanes replaced the camel paths. But the memory of the old ways, and of the careful vigilance that began after the Black Death, would live on in every pilgrim's step. For Mecca had learned once, long ago, that holiness alone could not protect a city, but wisdom could. And beneath the moonlit arches, where the marble still glows pale as milk, one could almost hear the echo of those first prayers after the plague. whispered softly by the living for the souls of the dead, and for the mercy that allowed the city to rise again. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had changed beyond the imagination of those who had once watched the plague creep across the sands. Steamships now crossed the Red Sea, carrying pilgrims from Egypt, India, and the far islands of Southeast Asia. The hum of machines replaced the bells of camels. Yet the journey to Mecca remained the same in spirit, sacred, humbling, eternal. At the port of Jeddah, the old gateway to the holy city, wooden dhows still bobbed beside iron ships. Here, the Ottoman quarantine stations stood like quiet guardians of memory. Every pilgrim arriving by sea was inspected, bathed, and given clean garments before continuing inland. The lessons learned from centuries of loss had become law. No longer was disease seen as an act of fate alone. It was something that could be studied, contained, and perhaps prevented. Doctors in white coats replaced the herbal healers of the past. Arabic, Turkish, English, and French filled the air as international health boards worked to protect the sacred journey. In 1893, a new outbreak of plague in Bombay sent shock through the Muslim world. The Ottoman authorities, remembering the horrors of earlier centuries, acted swiftly. Pilgrims were quarantined, ports were closed, and Mecca was shielded once again. The measures were harsh, but necessary. Inside the city, the call to prayer never ceased. Through war, empire, and change, the Kaaba remained untouched, a still heart beating within the restless world. The people of Mecca, descendants of those who had rebuilt it after the Black Death, lived by the rhythm of devotion. Their city was no longer the silent survivor of tragedy. It had become a teacher to all, a living example of how faith and science could walk hand in hand. In the 1920s, as the Ottoman Empire faded and new rulers rose, Mecca passed into the care of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The world outside buzzed with revolution, invention, and discovery. But within the sacred walls, the essence of centuries still lingered. Pilgrims arrived in growing numbers, by ship, by car, and soon by plane. Each carried stories from their homeland, and each became part of a story older than time itself. By now, medical tents lined the pilgrimage routes, water was sterilized, and hospitals stood near the Haram. The scars of the plague were still there, invisible but deep, a collective memory carved into the rituals of care, cleanliness, and compassion. Every drop of water poured for a thirsty pilgrim, every shade offered to a weary traveler, was a silent remembrance of those who once suffered beneath the burning sun and fevered nights. The World Health Organization, formed in the mid-20th century, often cited Mecca as a model of controlled mass gathering. Centuries earlier, the same place had been feared as a possible epicenter of contagion. Now it stood as a triumph of vigilance. The circle had closed. From death had grown discipline. From fear, understanding. Still, when the desert winds blow softly at dusk, when the marble floor of the Haram cools beneath the pilgrim's feet, there is a quiet presence in the air. The ghosts of the 14th century, the forgotten sufferers of the Black Death, who once wandered the same valleys in silence. Their names are gone, their bones dust, but their endurance built the very safety the world now takes for granted. In the deep hush after prayer, when a million voices fall still and the only sound is the echo of steps across the stone, feels as if time itself breathes. Mecca remains not only the heart of faith but the memory of human fragility. How the unseen can humble empires. How compassion can rebuild a city. How every act of care is, in truth, an act of worship. Now close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the wind sweeping softly over the Hejaz mountains. Imagine the call to prayer drifting through air clear and silent. The stars above Mecca glowing like distant candles. In this calm, centuries fold into one. The cries of plague-stricken pilgrims fade, replaced by the murmur of prayers rising from millions of hearts across the ages. Take a deep breath. Inhale the air that once carried the dust of caravans and the scent of oud. Exhale the weight of centuries. The fear, the pain, the endless struggle against the unseen. What remains is only stillness. What endures is only life. For Mecca has taught the world that holiness is not untouched perfection. It is survival. It is learning. It is the quiet decision to rise again, even after the darkest of nights. And as the final pilgrims depart beneath the glow of dawn, their footprints trace a single truth across the desert sand, that from every plague, there is wisdom, from every sorrow renewal. The city stands as witness, and the world in its endless turning remembers.